It's strange how the quietest hours of the night can make a voice feel louder than any scream. This story begins in a cramped, dimly lit radio booth on the outskirts of Melbourne in 1997. The kind of late-night show most people stumbled onto by accident, half static, half murmured music, with the occasional lonely caller to keep the host from drifting off.